April 1st, 1983. This is Joe Todd, an interview with H. Merle Woods. Mr. Woods, where were you born?
Parsons, Kansas,
Parsons, Kansas.
1894.
And when's your birthday?
The October 24th.
1894. Who was your father?
W.J. Woods. He was a lumber dealer.
Was he from Kansas?
Pardon me?
Was he from Kansas?
Iowa.
Iowa.
Mm-hmm.
And who was your mother?
Minnie L. Medor, M-E-A-D-O-R.
From Iowa?
No, she's from Kentucky.
Kentucky.
Yes.
And your father was in the lumber business?
He started in as a carpenter in Parsons, Kansas, and was employed by lumber yards there, and eventually was in business for himself at Dennis, Kansas, and then we moved to Oklahoma in 1907, spring of 1907, and he operated the Woods Lumber Yard at Welch, Oklahoma.
How come your parents came to Oklahoma?
My father's cousin had a line of yards in Oklahoma and Kansas, and he wanted my father to take over the managership of the one at Welch, and he purchased half interest in it then.
Mm-hmm. So you were in Welch when we became a state?
Yes.
What was statehood day like in Welch?
Well, I was going to school, and they dismissed schools for the day. In the meantime, I'd started as a printer's devil in March of that year at the old Welch Watchman. And that day, they turned loose at school, and the kids went downtown. The blacksmith, the main blacksmith there, fired 46 anvils. That is, if you understand how they fire anvils, they put black powder in the recess on top, then turn another one over it, and they have a little line of powder leading to the edge, and they take a red hot iron and touch that off, and it makes an awful lot of noise. So they fired 46 anvils that day.
You say you were a printer's devil?
Yes.
What is that?
Well, that means the one that does the dirty work around the plant. As a rule, they get ink all over their face and hands, and it looks like the devil.
And you started the school in Welch?
Yeah. Well, no. I started school in Kansas, Parsons, Kansas.
Mm-hmm. What was the name of the school in Parsons?
Garfield.
Garfield.
Mm-hmm.
Remember your teacher's name?
Kitty Lonberger, Longberger, was the first teacher.
How long did you go to school in Kansas?
We moved to Dennis, Kansas in 1904, and went to school then there until 1907. Then we moved to Oklahoma and went to the Welch School from then on through high school.
Is that the name of the school, Welch School?
Yes.
How big was Welch, the town?
About 300.
About 300.
I think now it's about 600.
Is it mainly a farming community, or?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Who were some of the prominent people there in Welch when you first moved there?
The editor was rather noted, Scotty Thompson. He had been a tramp printer, and he located there.
A tramp printer?
Yes.
What's that?
Well, just travel all over the country, work a few days here, and then get on a train, that is, hitch a ride on a freight car and go to the next town, or just wander around all over the country. In those days, print shops depended a great deal on, of course, everything was hand labor, and so they needed, times they would need extra help, and there were always a bunch of these tramp printers floating around to help out.
Who was the banker in Welch?
I should remember that, but Hugh Dobkins was one of the later ones. I just don't remember the banker when we first arrived there. A fellow named Bolio ran the principal drug department store there. Beaulieu.
What were the main crops raised around Welch?
It was noted for its hay crops. The native prairie hay, they'd bale that and ship it all over the country. There was quite a little corn.
Was there much cotton raised around Welch?
No, they had no gin there, and so there's no, at that time, very little cotton. They did mine quite a little coal around there, strip mine coal, and they still do to the present day.
What coal company was doing the strip mining?
I just don't know. No.
Do you remember the Depression of 1907, 1908?
I should say I do.
Can you tell me how it affected the town of Welch?
Well, the banks closed, of course, and that caused quite a little difficulty, but they issued scrip to tide them over. But it didn't do very much damage there. The farmers and people were pretty well organized with gardens and other business to tide over without much difficulty.
How did it affect you and your family directly?
Well, I was in the printing office, and it did bother the editor some, the fellow that ran the paper. But and father was running the lumberyard, and he had difficulty keeping getting money to operate on. But being a line yard, it didn't suffer as much as if it had been strictly local business.
Now you say a line yard.
That meant that he had the O.E. Woods Lumber Company. O.E. Woods was located at Oswego, and he had about 10 or 11 yards scattered around in Oklahoma and Kansas. And the yard at Welch, like the other yards, we kept reports of every bit of business and sent them in to the main office at Oswego, Kansas. Blue Jacket, Dowata, Claremore, Chelsea, and may have been at Oolagaw. I'm not sure about that. And then up in Kansas at Parsons, Fort Scott, Independence. Later the headquarters were moved from Oswego to Independence.
How long did your father work for the Woods Lumber Company?
He stayed there until 1930. He died in 1934 at Welch. but he had retired 2 years earlier.
What year did you graduate from high school?
1912.
1912.
Then I went to Baker University at Baldwin, Kansas for 2 years. That's a Methodist university.
What did you study there?
Just general courses, majored in Greek. But they had no journalism there, and so in 1915, transferred down to OU in order to take journalism.
Who was head of the journalism department?
Herbert, Dr. Herbert, H.H. Herbert. And I was on the staff of the paper. They had a semi-weekly paper when I first went there, but after the first year, they started the Oklahoma Daily, and I was on the staff of that as editorial writer.
How many students were at OU when you first went there?
1,500.
1,500. Did you live on campus?
No, they had no dormitories at all, and I had to live in private housing. I lived first a few weeks. I lived at a house near the campus, then moved to what was called the Wales House, W-A-I-L-S. Mrs. Wales was putting her 3 sons through school, and she had a little boarding house and kept students, and paid $15 a month for room and board. And that was a big help.
How long did you go to OU?
2 years.
2 years.
I got my degree there in 17.
Who was president of the university at that time?
Stratton D. Brooks.
What was he like?
He was a great old boy. He was from Missouri, had been born in Missouri, eastern Missouri, and he told a story that he didn't know where he was born. His family moved his house from one location to another and lived in the house while it was being moved. And he was born someplace between those 2 points.
Was Benny Owen there at that time?
Oh, yes. He was going strong. In 1915, the team was all victorious, the football team. Basketball was pretty much of a joke at that time. They had a little cracker box gymnasium with no out of down lines on the sides. They'd bounce the ball against the 2 sides, and the spectators were at one end of the room, and the officials were at the other end. And so they didn't do much in the way of basketball.
Where was the journalism school located? What building?
In one of the little frame buildings. It was part of the building was used for the print shop, university print shop, and I think the journalism school had 3 or 4 small frame rooms, and they were just frame construction, and any time we wanted to make any changes, we could put up a wall if we wanted to, and didn't have much furniture there. Professor Herbert, though, he had started the school in 1913, and so I got there just after it got going pretty good.
So you were one of the first students then?
Yeah.
At the journalism department. How many students were in journalism when you were going there?
I don't know the exact number. I imagine it's about 25 to 30.
Just north of the administration building is a round, it's like a park bench or
Spoon
something.
holder, they called it.
How did it get that name?
Well, that's where the students went to spoon. If you know what spooning means.
That was built in 1910?
I'm not sure about that. There was a date on it. I believe that was about right. In those days, the Sigma Delta Chi had just been established, and as a fraternity, a journalism fraternity, and their main project was once a year they got out Sooner Mollycoddle. It was a yellow journalism issue designed that way, and the year I was there, well, both years I helped write the thing. But in the second year, in 1917, we got into trouble. There was a student there from India, and he was very dark-skinned, and he's a good old boy, but he got awfully arrogant, and a number of the other students didn't like him for that reason, because he was so arrogant. He had too high an opinion of himself, and so some of the journalism students thought that he should be taken down, and so in this issue of the Mollycoddle, they wrote him up, and one of them called him a nigger, wrote him up as nigger, and they slipped that in. It wouldn't have gotten by but the ones who had the last say-so over the copy, somehow or other they slipped it in, and that caused a terrific sensation, especially among the missionary societies of the state, and they came in and demanded that the students be kicked out of school, and this Mollycoddle suspended, and so there were 6 of us in the Sigma Delta Chi were seniors ready to graduate in about 2 weeks, and President Brooks called us in and explained the situation to us and told us that he was under orders to kick all of us seniors out of school, refused to give us our degrees. Well, that made a pretty serious situation for us, and we explained the situation, how this slipped in without our knowledge. Any of the seniors, none of the seniors knew anything about it. And so after keeping us on the carpet for several days, he finally agreed that if the journalism fraternity would agree to kill the Mollycoddle and never issue it again, that he would let us go ahead and graduate, which he did.
How long did it last?
Pardon me?
How long did that last, the paper? The model column?
Mollycoddle. It is printed on yellow paper, and I'm not sure whether, I think it had just printed those 2 years that I was there. And it was never officially published again. At least the Sigma Delta Chi had no more responsibility for it. But I think one year there was some group there got together and put out one. But of course it was underground. The journalism fraternity had nothing to do with it.
And you graduated in 1917?
Yes. About 2 months before graduation, I'd been called by Bronson and Nichols, who published American here, they called me up one day, called up Professor Herbert. It was one night I was working there when they called him, and they wanted to get hold of a student to come over and take over the editorship of the paper. And Professor Herbert called me in to see if I would be interested in it, and I told him that I would be in 2 months, but I wouldn't be then. And so I thought that was the end of it. But 2 weeks before graduation, then Mr. Bronson called me to phone and wanted to know if I would be willing to come in 2 weeks. And I told him I'd be there the day after graduated. So I came over here the next day and went to work.
Did you go to World War I?
Yes,
You drafted?
I was in service. I'd started at here June 1st, 1917, and so I became interested in the Air Force, and I've been down Fort Sill, Old Post Field. One Sunday, my brother and I drove down there, and so they were just shipping in the airplanes down there then, and I got the fever and came back and went to work. I stayed on here, but in October, I decided to go on in to the Air Force. So I quit here and went home to Welch, Oklahoma. I'd sent in my application for enlistment, and they wrote back to stay at Welch until I got word. And then early in November, they told me to report to Muskogee for enlistment. Got down there and they said, well, they closed off there, come to Oklahoma City. So I came to Oklahoma City and enlisted. And then the next month, they called me to Fort Sill and a post field for examination, and I took physical examination there. Then they sent me home again, and it was March, late in March, they finally called me in and sent me to ground school at Austin, Texas, and I had 3 months there. And then after graduated from ground school, and went to Dallas. They were assembling the graduates from the 6 ground schools in the United States. The one at Austin was operated by the University of Texas, and all the graduates were gathered at State Fairgrounds at Dallas. They had to convert that into an assembly point for these graduates. And after 3 weeks there, the government had opened up this school. They decided they needed a lot of observers, aerial observers. Up to that time, they'd been using artillery officers to do the spotting, artillery spotting, for directing the ground, the artillery fire. So they sent, I was in the first class, they sent 60 of us from Dallas to Fort Sill, to the School of Fire there, to make artillery observers out of us. And they apparently didn't know how to treat us when we got down there. All the rest of that was an advanced artillery school for artillery officers. And none of us, or very few of us, knew anything about artillery, but they decided that we knew enough about spotting artillery fire from there that they could make artillery officers out of us. So I went through the school there then, the artillery school, but they busted a bunch of us out. They sent us back to Dallas, and just got back there, and decided that we could still operate as observers. So they sent us to Selfridge Field, Michigan, to train us there for our machine gun work, and to make what they called fighting observers out of us. That meant that we'd make long-distance reconnaissance flights back of the lines to spot and do mapping, photography, and then do some artillery fire spotting. So I was there then when the war wound up on November 11th, rather.
You say you went to ground school.
Yes.
What is ground school?
That's the first 3 months of training in mapping, in engine work, in radio. They were just starting radio then, and we had to learn telegraphy. And then much other information for aerial officers.
Now, was this at the University of Texas?
Yes. They used the old blind school at Austin for this ground school. By the way, Clarence Page has graduated that school too.
Who was in charge of that school? Who ran it?
Oh, I should remember his name, because he came here on a tour one time to Fort Reno with the possibility of opening up an arms school out there. I just don't remember.
Mm-hmm.
I can look that up and let you know.
So you were in Michigan when the war ended?
At Selfridge Field, Michigan, yes.
Okay. What was Armistice Day like in Michigan?
Up at Selfridge Field, it was the gloomiest day I ever saw. They were all disappointed because it didn't get overseas, and they were gloomy and cussing. Then on Thanksgiving Day, a lot of us took advantage of the chance to go to Detroit. They had a huge parade there, celebration parade, and Detroit, of course, was a huge armament factory, and in this parade they had all kinds of tanks and military material that they manufactured in that area, and it was quite a celebration. Then on December 13th, I got my discharge as an officer. That is, took us in, swore us in as second lieutenants, and discharged us then into the reserve, aerial reserve.
Did you go through OCS?
No, the OCS.
Yeah. Officers Training School?
Well,
Candidate School.
That was OCS. It wasn't called that. The OCS was for the other branches of service. This air service at that time was a part of was not the Air Corps. It was part of the Signal Corps. Signal Corps, let's see what they called it. It was a branch of the Signal Corps. And then during that summer, it was transferred and became the Air Corps.
Did you fly any during the?
I didn't take any flying training, no. I was, as an observer, I was supposed to get flying training before I went overseas, enough to be able to bring the plane home in case anything happened to the pilot. But I did get some flying training then in reserve officers camp.
Mm-hmm. Now, as an observer, now you were going to be an observer in the airplane, right?
Yes.
And you were to observe artillery fire?
Well, that was what I was trained for at Fort Sill.
Mm-hmm.
But when I got to Selfridge Field, it was primarily a fighting observer, which meant long-distance reconnaissance flights behind the lines. And that training was primarily for mapping, photography, and visual sightings of military objects.
When did you return to El Reno?
Well, I came home, it was December 15th, I think I arrived home at Welch, and then the 1st of January, I came back to El Reno. I'd had a letter right after Armistice, a letter was sent to my parents at Welch, and they forwarded it to me at Selfridge Field from Bronson Nichols wanting me to come back. And so December 1st, January 1st, 1919, I came back and took over the old job.
Let me regress for one moment. When you first started working in El Reno, what was your job?
Well, I was editor of the paper, and in fact, I took over all the writing, the editorial writing, the makeup of the paper, supervised the makeup. I made up the front page. I did that until I sold out. I kept always made up my own front page.
How many employees did you have working with you?
I was the only one. I was the whole staff of the news staff. And then in addition, I handled the circulation and later on I handled the bookkeeping too.
So you did everything then?
That's right.
Where was the paper located?
At 117 North Bickford.
What kind of building was it in?
It was a two-story building. It had been built for a post office. In 1909 it was built. The post office used it then, rented it from the owners until 1914. They finished the one block farther north on the east side of the street. It is located 2 doors south, but then in 1919, Bronson Nichols bought the building, and we moved into it in 1919.
Now, did they own the newspaper?
Yes.
Did they live in El Reno?
Yes.
And what was the name again?
E.S. Bronson and N.A. Nichols. They had pioneered a paper out at Thomas, Oklahoma in 1901. They'd come out, they'd organized, the people in Trenton, Missouri had organized a town site company, and the railroad people up there had joined in the thing, and they came to Thomas and started a town in a wheat field out there. And then they had made a contract with Bronson Nichols to start a daily paper there, and they could run it as a daily, had to run as daily the first 3 months, and then they could change it back to weekly if they wanted to, which they did. They had a tent there to start the paper in, but the next they'd brought a bunch of carpenters, and they built a frame building and opened it then 2 or 3 days later. Then in 1913 they sold the Thomas Tribune and looked all over the country for a new location, even went to Cuba. But they finally came back and bought this paper here, the Elderly American, and then 1921 I bought a third interest from them. I had left them for a short time and went to Veneta. And we Poe B. Vandermont and I started the weekly paper at Bonita. And when I left here, Mr. Bronson told me, "Will you be ready to come back?" Said, "We'll be phoning you one of these days." And so we'd been over there about 6 months, and he called up one day and said, "Well, come on back." I said, "Well, I can't get away from here." And he said, "Well, come on back and you can write your own ticket." And so I sold my interest then to Mr. Vandermont, who later moved to, ran the paper at Yukon, the Yukon Sun. But I came on back then, and they sold me a third interest in American. And Mr. Bronson and Mr. Nichols loved to travel, and they were very active in the National Editorial Association, and attended all the National Editorial Association conventions. So they turned the paper over to me, and they'd go on these trips. And, so I had the whole job to myself.
Can you describe Mr. Bronson and Mr. Nichols? What were they like?
Mr. Bronson was a very able newspaper man, and he was secretary treasurer of the Oklahoma Press Association from 1908 till his death in 1924. And he was very much interested in improving newspapers, and he was quite a booster for the journalism field at OU. In fact, before his death, he had made the proposition to the state legislature that if they would build a new J school at OU, journalism building, that he would give his Indian collection valued at $50,000 to the state. And the legislature accepted the proposal, passed the appropriation, and Governor Jack Walton vetoed the appropriation. So, but he was very much interested in the journalism school, and arranged to have the students attend the annual meetings of the Press Association, and to give reports on the journalism school at those meetings. And so he did a wonderful lot for journalism in Oklahoma by encouraging the better journalism.
And how about Mr. Nichols?
Mr. Nichols was more of a mechanical department expert, and so they made an excellent team. He was a wonderful printer, and believed in good machinery, and they developed, wherever they went, they developed well-equipped offices, which was unusual in those days. So they, as I say, they made an excellent team. But Mr. Bronson was an excellent advertising salesman. Mr. Nichols was an excellent printing salesman, so that made a good combination. They did need a good editor to handle the news. And
did you do most of the writing?
All the writing at first, yes. Except the country correspondence. Of course, we did have, at that time, we had, I think, around 50 country correspondents that sent in their community news every week.
Oh, go ahead, I'm sorry.
I did all the editorial writing, wrote the headlines, and it was a whale of a job, and it meant I was working about 14 hours a day and 6 days a week.
Mm-hmm. When you first started working, what was the main content of the news? When you first started working?
The main what?
Content of the news?
Oh,
the paper?
well, as a county seat town, we carried all of the county seat news, then naturally all of the El Reno news, and but very little state news. And we did buy some boilerplate to fill in most of the paper, if you know what that is.
What's a boilerplate?
Boilerplate is was bought through the Western Newspaper Union. It is news material made up in plate form that we'd just lock into the forms and fill in the corners when we needed something to fill up in a hurry. We'd use a lot of that.
Mm-hmm.
And then later, we bought syndicated material, which we would cast up in cast form and lock up in the forms. That'd be illustrations and even comics and things of that kind.
Mm-hmm. Did you do any work with the canteen over here during the First World War?
No, my partner, Mr. Nichols, was on that canteen staff, and he was one of that staff responsible for getting the canteen built. And it was built by railroad men, and they used those logs were telephone poles furnished by the telephone company.
How come they built that canteen? What was the reason
The
behind
Red Cross canteen here was set up when the troop trains were coming through here, sometimes several in one day. And they'd get in here, the men were hungry and thirsty, and no dining facilities provided on the troop trains. So and there were no dining facilities here. They'd have to go on into Oklahoma City or north and south in Chickasha. They had canteen arrangements there, but they would give them then cold drinks, cigarettes, and the people around here furnished cookies. In fact, all of the county and some outside the county would send in supplies of cookies, and they never knew when the trains were coming in, but they would assemble supplies for them, and the supplies of cookies and cold drinks and so forth. And then when they would, as a rule, the workers around here would tip off the Red Cross when their troop trains were expected, and they would rush down here and be ready then. And they took care of about 50,000 men during World War I, and more than 100,000 in World War II. Now in World War II, they didn't use that canteen. They'd moved it out to the park out here as a Boy Scout headquarters. And in World War II, the south end of this station, they'd made that into a canteen. And but they had a better staff in World War II, mm-hmm. had a much larger staff, and were able to furnish them much better service.
What was your opinion of Jack Walton?
He was a wretch, a disaster for the state. He was arrogant and he was crooked. He would he ruined the law enforcement situation in the state. He issued hundreds of pardons in advance. He'd send out blank pardons to the sheriffs around over the state, and or to his friends. And if some of his friends would be picked up, he'd immediately call on one of his friends that had the pardons, and they'd hand it to him, and he'd go scot-free. And he was just completely wrecked our law enforcement system in the state.
Why did they remove him from office? What was the main reason?
Well, primarily because of his refusal to abide by the law. He just broke the law in every way, and would refuse to pay attention to the legislature, and so they voted to impeach him.
How did he get elected in the first place?
By the labor element primarily. The farm labor group had gotten together, and then the Klan movement was pretty strong then, and the anti-Klan folks, he went in for the Klan, against the Klan, and the anti-Klan people got behind him pretty strong too. And the combination, farm labor, and the populists were pretty strong in the state at that time, and they joined in with the labor groups and the Klan groups, and the combination put him over.
How long was he governor?
I'm not sure, just part of one term. They kicked him out before his term was over, his 4-year term was over. And I remember it was in 1923, somewhere around there.
Was he the first governor removed?
Yes.
Were there, in the 20s in Reno, were there many flappers around town?
No, I wouldn't say so. This is a pretty serious sort of town, and hard-working people here, and they either had they were pretty high society or the bottom end of society.
What would you say a flapper is?
A flapper was a kind of a brainless type gal that was a little extreme in her dress and extreme in her conduct.
Were there many bootleggers or moonshiners around Reno in the 20s?
Yes, and a great many. Charlie Keith was the king of the bootleggers. He was a part Indian and pretty smart old boy, and he could, whenever he was arrested, he knew enough about law that he defended himself, and usually got off.
Where did he hide his whiskey and how did he deliver it?
Well, he usually kept it at his house, and then he would carry on his person. He'd carry a little around all the time and peddle it that way. And then at night, they would visit his house and load up. And then he had friends around that he would store supplies with, and he did a thriving business.
Where does the term bootleg come from? Bootlegger.
They carried the liquor in their bootlegs, their bottles there, the flat bottles that slip in their bootlegs. I'm going ahead with the newspaper story. Mr. Bronson died in 1924, and he was elected not only president of the Press Association just before his death, but also elected president of the National Editorial Association. And they knew he was dying. They had the national convention of the National Editorial Association in Oklahoma City that year, and he was responsible for bringing the national convention to Oklahoma. And so he was on his deathbed at the time of the convention. but he had made arrangements to have the convention, the visitors come to El Reno. After the main convention, they had a special train which came to El Reno and then went to Fort Sill and then made a tour to Mexico, then came back to Oklahoma City. And while they came to El Reno one afternoon, made a tour, went to Concho to put on Indian display there, and then to Fort Reno, and they put on a horse show and polo match out there, and then came back to El Reno, and the Chamber of Commerce put on a feed in the Masonic Temple, and then they went to the Elks' home, and they had converted the basement into a gambling hell. And there's a carnival here that had a bunch of those games, and one of them, by the way, is here in the museum, still here. I got hold of it and put it out here. But they gave them fake money, and they spent the evening there and had a high old time. And then at midnight, they closed up and came to the special train and went on to Fort Sill. Well, when the train came back to Oklahoma City, by that time Mr. Bronson had died, but some of them came over here then to the funeral. A number of them that were on that special train, and he was buried then out here buried at Enid rather. But then Mr. Nichols and I bought his interest in the paper, and then Mr. Nichols died in 1945, and I bought his interest. And I continued the American until 1958. I sold leased the paper then to the El Reno Daily Tribune. Now, I still own the title to the paper, but they still have the lease. Mm-hmm. Then in 1980, I sold the plant. I had an auction and sold the plant. I retained the job printing plant in 1958, retained the job printing plant and continued it until 1980, when I had an auction sale, sold the plant, and then I sold the building 2 months later.
Did you know Frank Greer?
No, I never did know Frank. I'd seen him at some of the meetings, but I never did know him personally.
Did you ever go in his place in Guthrie when it was the state capitol press?
Not at that time. I've been up there, of course, lately. I was on the committee they appointed a committee of 5 of us, the Press Association, to determine what machinery should be sold up there and what should be retained, and what other machinery they needed to go in the printing museum.
How did the Depression of the 30s affect you and your family?
We had an awful tough time, but Mr. Nichols and I managed to meet all of our payrolls. It finally got so bad one week that we had to pay off the payroll with checks which had been written by our customers. Some of those checks were not cashable, but we did pay off with those. The bank suspended payment on the checks for about 2 weeks, but we did pay off with some of those checks, and then after 2 weeks they were cashable, and the printers never lost any money. But we had to do a lot of work ourselves. It was awful hard to get printers then, but we managed to tide through, and by doing most of the work ourselves.
Mm-hmm. How many employees did you have in the 20s and 30s?
I think we must have had, let's see, in the front end of that time, we had a bookkeeper, and I had um, one fella assisting me. In the back shop, we had about 10 employees.
What was your, excuse me, what was your circulation in the Depression?
2,500 was,
2,500.
and at one time, the times got so hard that the farmers couldn't pay their bills, and so we made an agreement with them. Wheat was selling for 25 cents a bushel then, and so we were charging $1.50 a year for subscription, and we made the agreement with them that if they would bring in two bushels of wheat, we'd allow them 75 cents a bushel for it and give them their subscription. And in one day, we collected 300 bushels of wheat.
What'd you do with it?
We sold it to the mills out here for 25 cents a bushel.
How did the Depression affect El Reno and the Rock Island?
Well, the Rock Island, the Depression didn't bother particularly because they kept the trains running, but they had a bad strike in 1921, and that hurt the railroad worse than anything else because they fired, that is, they closed down the unions and refused to hire any more union helpers, and that really hurt the town worse than anything. But in the Depression, they kept the trains running pretty well and managed to weather that in pretty good shape.
How'd they settle that strike in 21?
Well, they didn't settle it. They just hired non-union employees and went from there.
Do you know anyone that went to South America with the Murray colony?
No, I don't. I wish I did. That would have been interesting to talk to them.
Did you know Governor Murray?
Yes, I did. In fact, after he, when he, in his declining years, he came here one day to sell his books. See, he had I think there were 5 or 6 books, and he came to the hotel here and stayed 3 or 4 days selling his books. And our office is right close to the hotel, and he would come down there and spend several hours every day, and I helped him sell some of his books, and then I bought a set of them and had him autograph them, and I gave those to the library here then recently.
Mm-hmm. What kind of man was he, Governor Murray?
He was a very smart man, posing as a hillbilly. When he went to went to Congress, he dressed up just like anybody, like the other congressmen, and was very highly respected for his constitutional knowledge. And he was an excellent constitutional lawyer. But when he ran for governor, he posed as a broken down farmer, and he ran a cheese and crackers campaign, he called it. He had a Ford car that he traveled around over the state, and dressed in just farmers' rough clothing, and he tried to appeal to the people, as of course at that time during the Depression, he appealed to the people as one of them, that he understood their problems, and so that appeal, and then the attitude of the Oklahoman and some of the bigwigs toward him, that he didn't know anything, that a freak, it disgusted a lot of people, and so they fell for his campaign. Now, he did make a good governor. He was against big business, against the universities, and against a lot of traditional things that were making the state snap out of it. And he didn't deserve re-election. He probably did some good for the state during the Depression on account of his attempts to equalize conditions.
Of course, I guess the thing I remember most about Murray was the bridge incident.
Yes.
How did he handle that? What happened with that?
Well, he sent the National Guard down to stop traffic on it. I remember him mainly because of one of the fights he got into. I was on the alumni board of OU, and he wanted us to put Frank, I've forgotten his last name, put him on the board of regents, and Murray didn't want him. The university wanted him to put on the board of regents because he was prominent in educational circles, and so the alumni board had a meeting over at the Murray residence one night, and we couldn't get him down to earth on what we were there for. Spent the whole evening visiting, very charming, his wife very charming and enjoyable. He was a very gracious host, but we couldn't get him down to what we were there for.
Did you know Manuel Herrick?
Who?
Manuel Herrick.
Yes, I met him.
What was he like?
Oh, he was a disaster too. He's just a freak, a retardee, and he was in a political accident, of course. You see, he ran for office. The Republicans didn't go for him at all, but he ran for office, and the Democrats got behind him and elected him.
I'd heard the story that he couldn't read or write.
I think that's right.
How could they elect a man that couldn't read or write?
Well, because they Democrats wanted to, I forget now just what the situation was. I think that the Democratic candidate had died after it was too late to elect
The filing had closed?
Yes. And so they, to embarrass the Republicans, they got in after Manuel Herrick and elected him.
Did he survive in Washington okay, Manuel Herrick?
Well, yes, of course, he's a laughingstock. It made a laughingstock of Oklahoma. And it was a terrible disgrace for the state.
Where's he from?
From Enid, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
Enid, or up there or around Enid.
Mm-hmm. What was the dust storms like in El Reno? Were there many of the big ones? In western Oklahoma?
They, of course, they blackened the skies and covered everything with dust, but we didn't have the bad winds here. They did farther in the west. But we did get the dust. Of course, the dust went as far east as the East Coast, but Uh, we had some pretty bad days, of course, but
Okay.
served on the draft board at the reformatory, and I did publicity for all the organizations. I took pictures of all of the draft groups that left here. They'd leave all times of day and night, but I took pictures of every group that left here, and have those negatives are in the library here now. And we were publishing the American Legion at that time, American Legion monthly paper. We printed it here. Milt Phillips was the editor of the paper, but in the last 2 years of the war, he went in service himself, and so he turned the editorship of that over to me, and I had to carry it on then until he came back two years later. And I was, at that time, I was on the Soldiers Relief Commission, which is now the War Veterans Commission of the state, and I was having to attend their meetings every month. And of course, we had a pretty heavy load of business during the war.
What did you do with the relief? What was
Soldiers Relief Commission, well, that looked after the Veterans Hospital at Muskogee, the Veterans Hospital at Sulphur, the Veterans Department at the State Hospital at Norman, and the Veterans Hospital at Oklahoma City. And then they had the Legion Children's Hospital at Ponca City, and well, the other other hospitals where the veterans were kept. For instance, one out at Clinton. Well, I believe that was the main ones.
Mhm.
They, of course, the organizations here in El Reno, all of the war organizations, they kept, I'd have to do a lot of publicity, special publicity for them, take pictures for them. But, and then we were very short-handed during the war. And so it is another thing about 14, 15 hours a day, all during the war.
They had a POW camp at Fort Reno.
What?
Well, there was a POW camp at
Yes,
Fort Reno,
that's
wasn't there?
right.
How many POWs were out there?
1,500 at one, altogether, I think.
Were they strictly Germans and Japanese?
German and Italians. See, most of them came from the African fighting. After they took so many prisoners there, when they won out in Africa, and they brought both Italians and Germans from that fighting over and filtered them out to a number of camps in Oklahoma and Kansas, and I guess other states.
How were they treated, POWs?
Fine. They were no comparison with what our prisoners had in Germany. They had to camp out here that for recreation. They set up a shop there, and most of them were excellent mechanics, and they could make things in the shop. Then they took a bunch of them out to work on the farms around here, and they would in groups. They'd have 2 guards to go with them, go to the farms. There's farms are shorthanded too, and in a few days they could do a lot of work for one farm, then they'd move to another one.
Ever have any trouble with them?
No, not here. They did in some of the other places, but the ones here were very peaceable, and they never had any trouble with them at all. In fact, there's out here in the museum, there's a letter from 7, signed by 7 of them, commending them for the treatment they had here.
Did any of them stay in this country, the POWs?
And no, they were all sent back. But they were, those who died in the different camps around here were buried out here in Fort Reno. They had their special burial plot on the west side of the Fort Reno Cemetery. And there were 70 of them buried there. Some of them they had trouble with and were killed in the other camps. And then some of them died from disease and so forth. I don't think any of them died here, but they were buried here because they had a government cemetery here.
Does the German government keep up the cemetery, or does the U.S. government, or
Well,
how does that
they
work?
had the military cemetery that had been here all the time. And so the government established this POW cemetery, and it has been governed since by Fort Sill. They still look after it.
Is there any correspondence with the families in Germany with the people buried out here?
Not only correspondence, but there was, they keep a register out there too, and many of the Germans, parents have visited out here. In fact, a number of them came here with the idea of moving their bodies back, but when they saw how excellent they were being treated here, and what a beautiful cemetery they have, that they decided to keep them here.
When's the first time you went to Fort Reno?
Yeah, let's see. It is during World War I, before I left camp, Major Monroe was in charge out there, and I visited there a few times that summer of 1917. And then after I came back from the war, I visited there quite often. In fact, they had established a Reno riding club for El Reno people and Fort Reno officers, and I belonged to that and visited there quite a little. And then our reserve officers, we had a city reserve officer, Fort Reno reserve officers post. No, there's El Reno reserve officers, and we met out there a great deal, and the officers, some of the officers out there usually met with us.
How many men were at Fort Reno in 1917, 1918?
I believe, I'm not too familiar with that. At that time, it was primarily a remount station to train horses and mules for artillery service and for mounts, cavalry mounts, and for overseas, mules for overseas. And I think there were only about 500 at the top.
Was it a cavalry post then?
No, it is a remount station.
Now, what's a remount station?
Well, that was a supply station to train horses and mules for military service.
Did they train them, or did they actually breed them here?
At that time, they had an extensive breeding program as well as training program. They'd train, bring them here. There's some of them pretty wild, and they'd train them here. And the vets would treat them, get them in good physical condition, and then they'd ship them overseas. Then in World War II, they were training horses and mules, but midway through, they abandoned horses for military service, had mechanized the military then, but they needed the mules for pack trains in the jungles of the Orient. So they started training pack trains here. They'd bring the kids here, some of them never seen a horse or had never seen a mule, and bring the wild mules here. And then they'd team them up together. In 3 months, they'd train a pack train, and they'd ship them out to the Orient, usually to India, and then they'd go from there over into Burma, in the swamps of Burma, and the mules, they could survive without feed, where horses required regular feed, and the mules could live on the land and could survive all kinds of difficulties that horses couldn't. So they made pack trains and shipped them out of Fort Reno until the war was over. And then they closed down then in 1947 and turned the thing over to the agricultural department. But that same year they decided they needed pack trains in Greece. Greece was being invaded by the guerrillas, the Soviet guerrillas, and were about to take over the country. And in the mountains there, Greece couldn't cope with them. So they trained and shipped over several shiploads of mules and sent men with them to show them how to use them. As a result, they turned the tide there, and the Greeks won out. Then they shut it down again. In 1951, they were having trouble in Turkey, and they needed more pack trains, so they opened it up again and shipped several shiploads of mules over to Turkey to fight in eastern Turkey in the mountains there, where the Russians were invading. So they won out there too.
Did they train mules for the Italian campaign in World War II? So they had mules up in the mountains in Italy, I believe.
I think they did both in Italy and in France. I know they sent horses to France, and I think they sent, I know they sent mules too. They had both horses and mules.
Bill Mullen wrote that book called Mud, Mountains, and Mules.
Mm-hmm. That's right. Yes, most of them came from here.
How big was El Reno when you came here in 1917?
About 7,000.
Who was the mayor?
Pete Duffy. Very colorful mayor. They had commission form of government. There were 3 commissioners, and Pete was the mayor. And he was a former newspaper man, a former part owner of the El Reno Democrat, and he loved to ride in parades. He always had a white horse, and he'd ride at the end of parades and there. But in 1927, then they voted out the commission form of government and adopted the manager form. Mm-hmm. And Pete then moved to Duncan and was employed there for a while as an attorney, and then moved to Oklahoma City and later committed suicide there. Died
in 45?
45, yes. And I bought his interest then and continued the paper until 58. Mm-hmm. In the meantime, there have been 2 other papers, the People's Press and the Daily Democrat. And in 1928, Eugene Pulliam, who had bought a number of newspapers in Oklahoma, came here and bought those two papers and changed it to the El Reno Daily Tribune.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. One thing I'd like to do, you mentioned several printing terms.
Better put that on.
Yeah, 1901?
1901, they had the big drawing here to open up the Kiowa Comanche country, which is 4 counties to the southwest, including Comanche County, where Lawton is. They opened it by a lottery. Before that time, they'd been having races. They'd race and they'd stake claims, and maybe 3 or 4 people stake the same claim, and then they'd have a shooting, and they killed off a lot of people that way. And they had fights too, and so they decided to have the drawing and the lottery instead of that. And they, when they had this lottery, at Lawton, they opened a registration center there and one here. And the people had a month to register for the drawing, to get their names in the pot. And they registered, there were, I think, 160,000 people entered their names. And then they had the drawing, actual drawing here. They brought the names from Lawton and had the drawing at the Irving School here on the north side of the building. And over 100,000 people came here that day for the drawing. And had 2 big hogsheads with the names in it. One of them, the names of Lawton, one of the names from here. And they had 12 boys who would draw the blindfolded, and they'd draw the names out. Well, they drew names for 6 days. And then instead of giving them the land, those whose names were drawn were given the first chance to draw the land, and they made their choice then. And the American, which was a daily at that time, there was a syndicate came from the east and bought the old El Reno News, which was a weekly paper, and made it into a daily paper, the El Reno Daily American. And they chartered a special train to carry the American issues to Anadarko and to Lawton. And they had a map on the front of it showing the farms which had been drawn, so that the people, they're anxious to get those papers so they could tell what lands were left, where to go to get the best lands that were left. And so for the drawing continued for 6 days, and American continued on, and then after the drawing, they continued to carry the map to still show what lands were left. And that lasted for about 3 months. But of course, after that year, the things subsided, and the big syndicate folded, and they sold it then back to some of the El Reno people.
Whenever a person got a lottery, how did he find his land? How did he go out and actually find it?
They had locators that they'd hire to take them to it. And a lot of them had an idea about where they wanted to locate. So they would, in the drawing, after they got their names, they would go to hire the locator to take them to this neighborhood, and then they'd look over what lands were left. They had the maps to go by then.
Yeah. I'd like to get some more printing terms, because you mentioned like the tramp printer and what's the other one? The boilerplate.
Boilerplate.
I'd like to get some more printing terms.
Okay. Well, a boilerplate was I've explained it.
Yeah.
Most papers had what they called patent insides. They were printed up at Oklahoma City and at Wichita and probably down in Dallas. And they were brought in by trains every week for the weekly papers. And the daily papers got daily. They were printed up. One side of the paper would be printed up, the other side blank would be printed locally, and they'd bring the paper in that way, and that way they carried quite a little state and national news. And then they also had advertising in them, most of patent medicine advertising, and so that practically all the papers did that. And on the Welch Watchman, we printed 4 pages and then had the 4 pages on the opposite side. We were printed by an old Franklin Washington hand press. All the weekly papers were printed by hand press at that time, and they would go to the station and wait for the paper to come in. Usually it'd come in the day before, and then they would they had to dampen it down in order to make it print right, and they'd dampen it down the night, and the next day they would go ahead and print it.
What are some more terms?
What?
What are some more printing terms?
Well, your presses, there were the Washington hand press, then the Army press, hand press. Those were the 2 main ones, and they said that in order to print a paper, you had to have a shirt tail full of type and one of those presses, and that's about all you needed. So they would trade subscriptions for almost anything they could get, groceries or eggs, produce, vegetables.
So you had the barter system going.
That's right. Now, in the print shop, they did have, most of them did have typewriters at that time, although when I went to work at the Welch Watchman, the editor wrote all his copies by hand. He didn't have a typewriter. But later he did get an old Oliver.
When did you have a linotype setter, a typesetter when you came here?
Yes, they did. They didn't at Welch. We set everything set by hand, and I could set, got to be a pretty fast typesetter by hand. And that helped me when I went to OU. I was the only one on the staff that knew how to, knew anything about the back shop. And we had, every night, one of us on the staff would take over the night shift and spend the night with the printer. We had one printer who would run the linotype, make up the paper, and then put it on the press. And we had to stay until the paper got the first issue off the press and read it for corrections. But I knew enough about the back end that I would set the headlines, make up the type, and make up the form. And usually when by the time he would finish the last of the type, I'd have everything in the form ready to go. And that way I'd usually get loose about 11 o'clock. Although on the special editions, it'd be an all-night job. But the others, not knowing anything about it, they'd have to wait for the printer to set the type, and then he'd have to set the headlines, make up the forms, and put it on the press, and then start the press rolling. So that it is a big help to know something about
Now,
that.
is that what you call a back shop where you do the actual
That's
typesetting?
the mechanical part of it, yes.
Okay.
Inferior regions, we'd call it.
When did you meet your wife?
Met her in 1922. She was a school teacher here, and I met her as a school teacher, and we were married then in 1924.
What's her name?
Sarah Scott was her name then. S-A-R-A. Scott, S-C-O-T-T. And she was quite a musician, and she taught 2 months after we were married, and then quit. But she did develop then a large piano class, and then later she started took lessons in music directing and directed Presbyterian Church here for 31 years.
Did she ever help you with the newspaper?
No, we agreed to start with that we would. She loved her music and knew nothing about newspaper work. I loved newspaper and knew nothing about music, so we went our separate ways in that respect.
Yeah.
Uh,
Turn that on. Okay.
Every newspaper plant is more or less of a historical repository. And so over the years, I'd collected quite a little material, and I was always interested in it. And so when Milt Phillips, after he came back, he was with the Historical Society for a while, and then I got him interested in newspaper work, because when he was editing the Legion Monthly, he would, and we were printing it here, he'd come in here all hours of the night. I gave him keys to the office and a desk and place to work, and he would come in at night and do a lot of work. The next morning I'd come down and find a copy for the next issue of the Legion Monthly, and so I told him, well, he ought to learn how to make up the paper too, and so I got him started on that. So he would come over when we were about ready to go to press, and he would help make up the paper, and got printer's ink under his fingernails that way. So he got on the board at the Historical Society, and he got decided that I should be too. And so in 1966, I went on the board of the Historical Society. But prior to that, I'd gotten into the Oklahoma Heritage Association. It was Frank Corn who organized the Heritage Association in Oklahoma. She lived here, and was a good friend of mine. And she had moved to Oklahoma City, though, after her husband died here. And she was very active in the Historical Society, and so she and Milt got together and decided I ought to be on the board. And in '62 then, the Heritage Association put me on the board, and I continued on that until 1975, I believe it was, that I asked to be relieved. And I stayed on the Historical Society until 76, I believe I went off that. But when we started the museum here in 1968, started our Historical Society in 1968, our first project was to get a museum. And we knew that this building at that time was vacant and was going to pieces. The vandals were damaging it. And we asked for title to it. And so they turned it over to us on a year-by-year lease, $1 a year. And then later, the president of Rock Island said that he would give us title to it. And we thought we had a title to it, but we didn't. We found out later when when it went into bankruptcy, the trustee found out that we didn't have title to it, and it told us we had to either buy it or give it up. That was 2 years ago, and we had it last year. It was 2 years ago it told us that, and so then we started Save Our Museum campaign, and the price was $68,000, and so we had a campaign and used all sorts of different methods of raising money, and we actually raised $10,000 more than we needed before it was over. But we bought it then, and we do have title to it now. But when we started the Historical Society, the Lions Club here voted to attempt the project of setting up an El Reno Society, and asked all 5 civic clubs to send representatives to a meeting. Well, that meeting was held at our Carnegie Library, and we formed that in 1968. And then instead of making an El Reno Society, we decided to make a Canadian County Society out of it, and brought in representatives from all over the county. And so it is the Canadian County Historical Society. And I've been one of the officers ever since.
How long did it take you to raise the money to buy the building?
Well, they told us, I think it was about midway in 1980, that we had to have the money in 3 months. But then they extended that time and finally told us that they would give us till 1st September 1982. And so we started working on that basis. Then they came out with a new rule that we had to have it early in 1982. Gave us 3 months then. I think that was in November, December, gave us 3 months time. Well, we organized it and actually raised money within that time, but then they went back to the September 1st date, and we raised money then and put it out as interest. So that's where about 10,000 of that. Now, on the State Heritage Association, which is first the State Memorial Society, they changed it over to the State Heritage Association. I was vice president and treasurer of that for 2 years, and then at the time Stanley Draper was very active over there in it. I never held any special office in the Historical Society, but I was on a number of the committees there.
What committees were you on with the Historical Society?
Well, the microfilming committee was the main one. Milt Phillips was the one that started the microfilming, and I don't know whether you know the history of that. They started it in 1947, and you got the papers agree to, well, going back to the start of the Historical Society, it started the Kingfisher in 1893, and the newspapers at that time agreed to send 2 copies of the paper to Kingfisher, to their temporary offices there, to form the nucleus of a museum. And then that was later moved to Norman, then to Oklahoma City, and then eventually to the present place in the historical building. And during all those years, those newspapers were accumulated and put in the basement of the present building, and most of them a lot of them are still there. And they started microfilming them in 1947. That is when they launched that. Milt was chairman of that committee on that, and they did a good job. They microfilmed them through 1917, completed that job. Then in 1947, they started microfilming them as they came in. But that gap in there, the 30 years, nothing was done. And they were left in the basement there, and they're deteriorating. Attorneys were getting down there and clipping out legal notices and so on. And they were handling them. They were going to pieces pretty bad. They're making an effort now to do something about it. When Milt went off the commission, they put me in as chairman of microfilming, and I did my best to get the thing going. Glenn Jordan, did you know him?
Jordan Reeves? No, Glenn Jordan.
Glenn Jordan. Yes. He had big boasts of what he's going to do, and made all kinds of agreements, but never lived up to any of them. And he was going to get this interim, 30 years interim, taken care of right quick. Well, he went to the Press Association. Press Association agreed to go to the legislature and ask for $70,000, which was supposed to microfilm, because Len had said that they would get the state prison system to provide prisoners and provide microfilming to take care of that for us for $70,000. Well, they sent one set of the films in, first set, and they decided right quick that they had no more of that. They were just terrible. Mary, what's it called?
Mary Moran.
Mary Moran, tell you what, what resulted. She was there at the time, and they were terrible. They just couldn't use them at all. So they abandoned that right quick, and then tried to let a contract for them to do them all, and the cheapest contract, I think, was $270,000 or something. So and then Glenn, they kicked him out, and do you know the story of that?
Yeah.
There were 18 of us voted to kick him out, and he had sued every one of us for $250,000 apiece, and so we had to hire an attorney to represent us. Of course, he didn't get anywhere, and so they kicked the case out of court. But our attorney's fees were $600 apiece, and we all of us had to pay that fee. And they talked like the state would probably pay it, but they didn't, and we did. But Len didn't get anywhere on this microfilming, and so now Ben Blackstock is on the Historical Society commission, and he's the chairman of that department now, and he's been after him pretty strong, and he hadn't been able to accomplish any big thing on it, but they are they have got two machines, I think, going now, where they only had one before, and they are beginning to catch up some of that back work. And they hope that, they think that'll be the cheapest way to do it, spread over several years. But it is so easy before to pull the funds out of that we set up for it and put it in some other department.
Well, what time is it?
12:15, 12:17.
Yeah, I think so. I think you have a good interview. Thank you.
Well, a lot of it isn't pertinent maybe, but some of it might be.